And I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. She comes to us from the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, Professor Andrea Arai. She specializes in socio-cultural anthropology and Japan. And some of her recent publications include Japan After Japan, Social and Cultural Life from the Recessionary 1990s to the Present. And one of my favorite academic titles that I've seen in a while, it's called The Neoliberal Subject of Lack and Potential, Developing the Frontier Within and Creating a Reserve Army of Labor in Japan. So I present to you Professor Andrea Arai.
Students give me a lot of trouble for that title.
I love it.
You like it?
I love it.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't let me cut it, so, great. Okay. Well, I'm very glad that, oh, that's loud. I'm very glad that, that Jeff went before me, because as you'll see, these talks were not planned to be back-to-back, but they're very related. And they're very related in several of the things that you just talked about in the questions and answers. They're related because of the image that Japan produced and was produced forward in the world. The ways that the Japanese spoke back to the United States as if we were then the teenagers, right? Famously by past Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro that I'll be mentioning in this talk. But for many other reasons too. The representations of Japan as number one that have now, sort of immigrated to China as in various complex ways. And I think what's not taken account of adequately, and that I'm writing a book about right now, is the ways that these representations and images produce effects in the places and on the places they're about. And even as these appellations of number one or miracle or whatever they may be, that leave a great deal out as they produce these huge generalizations, even as they fade and move, the population that they described is affected in very important ways that we miss at our risk, right? When we talk about nationalisms or we talk about anxieties and things like that, we really have to take this history of representations into account too. And that's part of what my talk today is about. So I'm going to read some of this. I will go very slowly as I read. And I will be talking through a series of images that represent some of my research on the social and cultural effects of the recessionary period in Japan. So here's the first one. How Japan does it, the world's toughest competitor. I've chosen to open my talk today with this Time magazine cover from, not today, as you might imagine, spring 1981. As familiar as this image of Japan was throughout the 1980s, it is almost non-existent today, difficult even to find on the internet. This means that most young people are unfamiliar with this indomitable but also inscrutable representation of Japan, even though, as I will explain today, it continues to influence the present. And according to Jeff Wasserstorm in the book he was just talking about and told you, the Chinese, now considered number one in place of Japan, are considered the new inscrutable, a dubious honor, as I will suggest in the following. This past August, I was quite unexpectedly reminded of one of the ways this view of Japan continues to influence us all. At a wedding ceremony for a childhood friend's son here in Portland, actually, I found myself in conversation with her older brother, whom I had not seen for several decades. Catching up, he explained that he'd gone on to become an architect and real estate developer in LA, and as I related, I'd become a Japan anthropologist. He was very surprised to hear that. On hearing about my profession, he quite suddenly declared, and I quote, "Up until a short time ago," we're standing at a wedding ceremony, right? "Up until a short time ago, we thought we'd all be speaking Japanese, and look what happened." So as an anthropologist, I of course took careful note of that. In my talk today, I'd like to begin with what has happened, not only in Japan, but to the meanings of this Time cover image. Us all speaking Japanese or not, as it turned out, This image and his comment provide an important window into the history of changes that have happened in and to Japan since the mid-1990s bursting of the financial bubble, in particular at the level of representation that we are perhaps less accustomed to thinking about. As I argue today, however, representations are central to understanding the effects of long-term recession on contemporary Japanese life. In the following, I discuss how the bursting of this bubble and its halving of the Nikkei stock index and nationwide property values, actually in half, they dropped by half within a period of a couple of years, produced a crisis of certainty, or what has been called in Japanese a moral panic. I will explain how this crisis or panic focused itself on the same social institutions, the home, school, and childhood, that had been so highly credited with producing Japan's ascendancy as an economic force, an economic force which many believed, including my friend's brother, that would rival the United States, a short half-century following its defeat and occupation by the US. Anthropologists refer to the home, school, and childhood as key sites and times of social and cultural reproduction. As the famous cultural anthropologist Franz Boas, mentor of both Ruth Benedict, who you may know from the writing of The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and even more popular in American 1950s culture, Margaret Mead, argued in the early 20th century, culture is learned, not inherited. Thus, we might think of the home, schools, and childhood as key places of not only personal, but national and cultural learning. What I mean by this will become more evident as we go along. They were also those parts of Japanese life that became the objects of intense study over the period of the late 20th century, as foreign observers tried to understand, how do the Japanese do what they do? And they have also been the areas and times of life that have come under the sharpest critique and admonition, both within Japan and without, since the bursting of the bubble and failure of Japan to redo it. The Japanese economic miracle, which, as I will go on to suggest, was no miracle at all, created new cultural conditions and realities along with economic ones, realities that have influenced the policies and views of several generations in Japan and the world. In my talk today, I focus on how childhood, schooling, and the home became the targets of this crisis of certainty about the life course in Japan, and the ideas, policies, and changes that this crisis thinking has brought about. I begin with the images and ideas of Japan as number one, and this is one of them, in the 1980s, and the fear and fascination that accompanied them. I next proceed to the figures and images of crisis of the 90s and 2000s. My anthropological, or as we call it as anthropologists, ethnographic research began with the first of these images of strange kids and collapsing homes and schools, the events associated with them, and the public policies they affected. I have followed the changes in and figures of crisis, along with the effects they have continued to have throughout the present. Going too fast? Okay. I think it's important to pause and say that while I will be talking about the recessionary period in Japan, I will not be going into detail about economic data. This data is, to be sure, important. So too is an understanding of the creation of the bubble in Japan, what it had to do with the US-Japanese relations during the Nixon era, as well as the macroeconomic thinking of the time. Though many in the United States believe that Japan's economy was impervious to the fluctuations that we experienced in the US from the oil crisis of the 70s on because of their culture, this was certainly not the case. The famous, and to some infamous, Japanese double-digit growth of the late 50s and 60s, remember the charges of dumping and the bashing of Sony boomboxes, came to an abrupt end in 1973. After this, Japan entered its low growth period, and a series of policies aimed at deterring and deferring the kinds of unemployment and massive layoffs experienced in the US. And Japan's example was the US at the time. These kind of layoffs and things that wreak such havoc on the social fabric as, again, we're seeing in the United States today. So my talk instead focuses on the realm of the cultural, to explain some part of how it's changed in Japan. As I said before, a foundational premise of cultural anthropology is that culture is learned, not inherited. This means that as conditions, political, economic, international, social, and historical change or shift, so too in complex ways do the ways that people identify, imagine their lives, pasts and futures, and their place in the world. That's the introduction. Now I'm going to talk about this wonderful cover. How do they do it? The high-tech and traditional. What's important in this first image from Time magazine in the 1980s is how conflicting ideas, tradition and high-tech modern, seem to coincide or coexist without problem in this Japan. The modern is, after all, that which replaces the traditional or older forms of life, and in replacing them typically erases and negates them, turning them into arenas for nostalgia. The image of Japan here, however, suggests that did not happen. Japan remained traditional while becoming modern. How did that work? The most common explanation given was that Japan's culture was so strong and so long that it could withstand the tremendous changes of their modernization, as Jeff was talking about in China now, without changing itself. But of course, this is at the level of representation, which, as I said before, is often something that works on and through us without careful consideration of the ideas and positions it produces. So Japan became the accepted anomaly, the first non-Western nation to modernize, and as it seemed at the time, to threaten the superiority of the West. As Ezra Vogel in his famous Japan is Number One noted at the time, the Japanese has come up with solutions to problems we cannot solve, and done it while maintaining a level of productivity that is, as he famously noted, 3.5 times that of the British and Americans. And he talked about, as I'm going to explain later, the 3.5 times worker, the Nissan worker that could produce, exponential amounts of. And this was, some sort of magical ability, right? And of course, all again laid at the feet of culture. He, like others at the time, Professor Vogel, like others at the time, suggested we learn from the Japanese, if this sounds familiar now, right? And Japanese leaders like Yasuhiro Nakasone, friends with past President Reagan and Britain's Margaret Thatcher, spoke back to the US about our weaknesses, and this is also reminiscent of what Jeff was just saying, particularly in Nakasone's words, "We're too heterogeneous. You should be more homogeneous like us." And nobody bothered to ask, what does that mean, right? Because if it adds up to success and, top test scores and best GDP, then why should you ask, right? Until it's not there anymore. The other claim that was commonly made of Japan was that it was homogeneous and hence stronger. So if you're homogeneous, you're stronger. Which was to say that when you are homogeneous, things work better, smoother, and somehow everyone agrees. Right? No critique. In fact, this kind of thinking within Japan came to impose a kind of self-censorship, as Norma Field, very interesting writer on late century Japanese, has written famously in The Realm of the Dying Emperor. She's a product of some of these intertwinings of the United States and Japan, born as a wartime baby with a GI father and a Japanese mother. At that time grew up without citizenship. She's written a lot about this, the problems of calling yourself homogeneous and having the world call you homogeneous, and how you would allow difference in that, sort of a very sort of dense climate of representation. So as a result of claims to homogeneous, or that all Japanese are basically the same, and not only racially, but mentally, they all think the same, experience the same. How does that exactly, happen? Meanwhile, while what Vogel and other admirers of Japan's success did not talk about were the costs of all this success and what we might more accurately call standardized homogeneity. Homogeneous homogeneity at this level is not natural, it's cultural, meaning that it's created. Right? So some of the costs of all the success, death from overwork, the devotion to the corporation to the extent that white-collar workers, mostly gendered male at the time, barely made it home on weekdays, the anti-DEP school curriculum that produced #1 children and test scores but took their tolls in various ways on the youth, tens of thousands of children who at the time were unable to go to school, they're called school refusers, not to mention the toll on mothers who were made responsible for this success and later derided for producing children that had trouble. But none of this was very interesting to the West because what they saw was success and a managed society, which at the time looked like a really good thing. There's a great deal more to say here about the period preceding the 1980s. The National Character Studies of Japan, Ruth Benedict's Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which I still teach about at the University of Washington, and most people have left it behind, but I really feel this is an important part of history. How she, as a student of Franz Boas, and there's a long legacy to his writing and the very idea of cultures that he made famous. Not culture, but that people all over the world have a culture. As I tell my students, if you were born in the beginning of the 20th century, you wouldn't say, in my culture, because there was no such idea. So he famously created this idea, taught it to his students, and from there, how did she write about this culture of Japan in this way is a very long and fascinating story, unfortunately, that I don't have time for here, but at another time. So there's a great deal more to say about, what preceded the 80s. It created these ideas about, the uniqueness of Japan, homogeneity, #1, all of these things, both in academia and the popular media. That's another period, right? I'm starting with the 80s today. Or we might go back, because it's very connected, to the creation of the nation state in Japan in the Meiji period, the first non-Western nation state, right? When the new state undertook the conversion, and it was a conversion, of its diverse population, and the population was very diverse from one end of Japan to the other, into a unified national community with a common language, because at the time, from one end of Japan to the other, dialects were mutually unintelligible. And if you travel to other ends of Japan right now, some of them that are unfortunately very devastated, like in the Northeast area, you'll still find people who speak a Japanese that even my husband, who's a Japanese national, can't understand. They don't speak in the media anymore, or if we think about Okinawa. So the conversion of its diverse population into a unified national community with a common language, identification, a modern emperor system, military, industry, education, and were civilized and enlightened, to use the national slogans of the day, into well-disciplined citizens. And again, citizens, as I think the resonances with Jeff's talk are very strong here, who could represent a modern nation. And one of the things that didn't come up in the question and answers to Jeff's that might come up in this is, what does modern mean? Because modernization is not the same thing as modernity. And the modern that the Japanese were headed for was both of these, right? It wasn't just modernization, it was modernity, and that is a very different thing. Right? And it's the very nature of, as the Meiji intellectuals said, we're not just going to build schools and industries, we're going to change the character of the people, because they need to be to be recognized as modern to the rest of the world, hygienically, posture, behavior, everything. So these national campaigns spread from one end of Japan to the other to actually teach people how to be modern citizens. This is not the first time it happened. The Brits and the French did it too, to their lower classes, right? Looking modern and appearing modern on the world stage was not just a matter of politics. And that's one of the important points here. Okay, but I'll stop there in the interest of moving on to what I said my talk was about, right? The figures of the economic downturn, the crisis figures of the economic downturn. Since much of what I just said about how Japan is thought of and thinks of itself has now shifted. Now I get to see if I can technologically move this. Oops. Okay, I did it. So in Japanese, this says, in the big blue letters anyway, kodomo ga henda. Or this could be read many different ways, but for those Japanese in the audience, please pardon, you can ask more about this, but for right now, I'm translating as the child is strange. It really means changed and strange. There's all sorts of different ways to think about this. Okay. This image here is of a school child changing or morphing into something non-human-like, and it goes, this little creature runs around the other side of the book. This image is not frightening in particular, but marks the early 1990s moment when the claims began to be made that something was strange or changed in the children of Japan. And remember, this is just after the bubble has burst, right? Actually, several years after the bubble has burst. A part of the talk that I'm not giving today is that through the first years, even though the Nikkei fell by so much and real estate prices really sort of dropped so incredibly, I have a personal story about this, that my husband and I were living in an area outside Tokyo at the time. It was 1991, and we were just going into the real estate person's office, and they read the entire document to you, word by word, sort of long process. And I remember I didn't understand every bit of it at the time, and I remember my husband turning to me and saying, "That's strange. The last time we sold an apartment, we made a lot of money on it," like a lot of money, right? Because property values continued to double. And we're coming out less this time. 2 months later, the values fell again. And everyone that we knew on the outskirts of Tokyo was underwater. They will never sell those homes. Their lives were changed forever, which was something up until a few years ago nobody in the United States either cared or knew about. That was just like the Japanese disease. Now we have, our own unfortunate realities to deal with, and through those years, everything about what the Japanese did wrong, it's that culture, it's the same culture that made them so famous, now it's ruining them. There were all these things, now we don't talk in those exact terms anymore. But, these were realities that changed people's, lives, like they're changing them here in really incredible ways. But they also, as I'm arguing today, as a result of this sort of very dense and intense representation of Japan that it then took on to itself, and sort of those conversations back and forth, as I think Jeff would have continued, is just about to happen to China. When this moves, it leaves an incredible legacy with it. And I think that's part of the important story of what's going on in Japan now. When the claim began to be made that something was strange or changed in the condition of children in Japan. This second image is more ominous, as people have pointed out to me. In Japanese, it says kodomo ga abunai. As a child now seemingly older, and this is a junior high age child, and there's very good reasons for this, seems to fade from view. This is an image of the danger of the child, or the dangerous child. And child here is a representative term. I mean, it stands for things that were happening with children, but it has reverberations throughout the conversations, as we'll see in a second. It also has to do with this teenager adult, who's the adult, who's the teenager, what's a child, what's childlike. Can nations be children compared to other nations? Yes, of course they can. That's, sort of the main tropes of colonialism and things like that. It's an idea and image that came to suggest the sudden breakdown, the word used in Japan was hokai, of the systems of social reproduction in Japan. Homes and schools were said to be suddenly collapsing, and fear of the young, not only of them doing something dangerous, since this was a moment accompanied by several highly sensational and sensationalized youth violence incidents that I've written about other places, but moreover, a fear that the vitality or energy that produced the Japan of number one had somehow and very suddenly been lost. Both individually and nationally, Japanese began to feel as uncertain about the way they did things as they had been certain before. Particularly for my purposes here, how this stable and systematic life course from school to home to corporation that produced the 3.5 times worker of the 1980s had broken down. The famed Japanese way seemed to have suddenly vanished. And with it came a doubting of everything, all the knowledge about how to lead one's life, raise their children, and think about the future. And if you went into bookstores at the time in Japan, some of this has changed right now, you literally saw hundreds of books about collapsing schools, problematic children, new ways to child rear. I mean, really sort of this incredible searching around what I'm calling these sites of national and cultural reproduction that was really a larger story, right? Of these financial futures, about Japan in the world, but all sort of settled on, these very sort of local sites, which made it more impactful because there's big politics around strange children. And that, did a number of things that I'm going to go on to talk about. It had these very concrete effects. So just to stop and recap here briefly for a moment, to anticipate some questions, not that I'm trying to ward them off, but just to anticipate some. What I am not saying is that the Japanese just flip-flop. Suddenly, which is our famous word, right? Suddenly think they're wonderful and then just as suddenly not. What I am making an argument about, as above mentioned, is the changing realm of the cultural. That is to say that national communities and the individuals within them think about themselves and live their lives on the basis of ideas and forms of knowledge, and these change, produced about them domestically and internationally, and that there is a complex interplay between domestic discourses and international ones. I'm arguing that the crisis of certainty was an effect of the trajectory of certainty about Japan prior to the bubble. This certainty deemed that culture was immune to changing conditions and historical contingency, and as we have discovered all too well, this is not the case, neither in Japan or here in the US, for that matter. One larger point to be made here has to do with crisis atmospheres themselves. As anthropologists have learned, these are key sites and places from which to understand the realm of the cultural, or again, how ideas and beliefs are formed and the power they have in all of our lives. And I'm sure if they gave anthropologists money to study the contemporary United States right now and what it means to be ungovernable in any number of things, we would rush. And hopefully some of us, among other people, will. Sometimes one wants to think that while there's an excess of nation in Japan, there's a real dearth of it here. And apologies for political points about that. Okay, next slide. This is a very interesting one. This is a much more recent one. Those were from the early 90s. This is from 2006. In December 2006, and I need to give you some background to understand this. This is a picture from The Economist. In December 2006, the fundamental law of education was revised in Japan for the first time in 60 years. A lot of people don't know about this. They really want to. Because even though education in the United States is not considered something that we really need to put a lot of time and effort and money into, or maybe we'll change our minds about that, right? In Japan and China and lots of other places, they know that this is not only, sort of the major area of socialization, but this is the way you train your population, and leaving part of your population behind, I mean, to be honest, in the Meiji period, women were given schooling, but only a particular kind of schooling to be particular kinds of mothers, but that changed after the post-war and due to this law, right? The nature of education in Japan changed, and that was the place where the American occupation, that was one of their first arenas. They blackened those school books. They knew that education is a key site, and maybe in the United States we'll sort of to other educators, I think it's fair to say that, right? Sort of get this in a bigger way. Okay, so the fundamental law of education, that's what this is about, was changed for the first time in 60 years. Often called the Education Constitution, that's how important it was. It was written at the same time as the new post-war democratic constitution in Japan. There's lots to say about that too. This law represented a kind of revolution in education and national thinking about the rights of the individual in Japan, students, teachers, and parents, with regards to what they would learn, how they would be taught, and so on. National education in Japan and many other nations, as I just suggested, is one of the central arenas of socialization and what anthropologists call enculturalization, right? Teaching culture to people. Not that it doesn't enter your cells through the air. This image is taken from The Economist magazine in the same year as the revisions occurred. They were pushed through by the then Abe government some time ago in terms of prime ministers. The claim by The Economist was that nothing ever changes in Japan. Again, the Japanese were forcing or screaming in this picture patriotism into their students. Japan never changes. That was the message. In fact, The Economist, which I really love, but in this case, got it really wrong. Part of my research also involved studying the changing ideas and policies that led up to and finally made this revision possible, by which I mean that for 60 years the Japanese population, and I know there's sort of a lot of popular opinion that Japanese are very sort of docile and they go along with their government. Not true too. They stand up a lot of times, think of the 50s, other times they're environmental groups, and they stood behind their education law. They protested it and they kept it there, even though the American, in the latter part of the American occupation, there was something called the reverse course, and the Americans suggested that maybe you should just remilitarize and change that education back because we need you as an ally against somebody else more formidable. So this came up against, and conservative governments came up against a lot of opposition, but it was kept, and there's a certain amount of numbers of proponents that the government needs in order to change it. It was finally changed in December 2006. I'll explain why. What made this change possible, and to even begin talking about patriotic education again, and that was one of the main names of the revision. We need more patriotic education. It's called Aikoku Shin or Aikoku Kyoiku in Japan. What made it possible, made it possible to even begin talking about patriotic education again, an idea that surely resonated with pre-war's ideas of reverence for the emperor and nation, eclipsing the right of the individuals, was for many Japanese what I'm calling this crisis of certainty about their national futures and children and their learning in particular. As both the media and individuals I interviewed at the time described, something had to be done to change what became known as the hearts of the young. Right? So many people were talking about sort of the changed, in Japanese, the word is kokoro. It's a very complex word. It means sort of a combination of heart and mind, but sort of the ways, the psyche of, if you wish, in English, but it has a much more complex sort of genealogy than ours does. So to change the hearts of the young, and that's exactly what this patriotic education purported to do, right? It was going to be called an education of the heart, right? Because Japanese children are really, sort of not connected to their nation, and they're no longer willing to sacrifice it for it as their parents did, but there were very good reasons for that, because a lot of things had changed since their parents' generation. In fact, as I write about in one of my latest pieces called here's another whopping title, Notes to the Heart, National Lessons in Sentiment and Sacrifice, about the changing of this law, coming out in a new volume on East Asia that I've just worked on with a China anthropologist and Koreanist. The revisions to the education law were much less about the past and retrieving it, as The Economist suggested and the conservative government suggested, and much more about trying to deal with the new conditions of the recession. I'm going to show you a couple of things now. This was a supplementary textbook that was part of the patriotic education move. In Japanese is written Kokoro no Noto, and I've translated it as Notes to the Heart. There might be other ways to translate that. This is the volume for elementary school children. I write about this at length in this piece I just talked to you about. This is the one for junior high school children, And this is the one I'm going to talk about. This is the page in it that I'm going to talk about. And the title is Jibun o Sodateru, or I've translated that as raise yourself, or raising yourself, or I'll raise myself, things like that. Okay. These images, the last three I just showed you, are from the covers of supplementary textbook notes to the heart. Handed out or gifted, they were actually given as gifts, because if you're handed out, they have to go through a complex review system in Japan, and they wanted to circumvent that, not because they're obviously problematic, but they wanted to get them out very quickly. And they were given to students from one end of Japan to the other to use as they like, which is also very, very interesting. Anyway, one of the key messages in these notes, which have been called the new morals curriculum, and that's also very interesting, is to raise yourself. Well, what does this mean, right? You know, we typically don't think of Japanese in this way. It means that unlike the past, the schools, companies, and government have stepped out of the business of preparation and management of the citizenry, you know, that production of this homogeneous citizenry, right? This is financial as well as ideological, as well, and along with that, as well as guaranteeing futures. Patriotic education, as we find out here, is about being responsible for yourself in ways that in America, you know, we've gotten all too used to, as my husband says, help yourself. And still finding a way to, so being responsible for yourself, but still finding a way to love your nation, even as it promises you less than it did before, and ask for equal sacrifice, especially from certain sectors of the population. That was the reason for the subject of lack and potential article. It's about accepting a non-homogeneously produced population, since these things are projects, not natural processes. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about each of these, and I'll be happy to answer in the Q&A. Okay, here's my last one. The part-time labor force. Finally, the last image is one about the new conditions of work in Japan and how they have been affected by the recession. This group on the bus is the new part-time, and this is taken from a national television documentary, actually, called the Floating Freighter, which is the name of this part-time labor force. It's a word that's a combination of the German Arbeiter, which means part-time, and the English free, which is not very free. There's much more to say on the subject of the new conditions of labor in Japan, the fear of restructuring, and this part-time labor force. I am going to end there, though, with just some final comments, because I'd like to leave time for that. There's a lot to talk about here. I'd like to end with a note about the most recent events of March 2001 in Japan, in the Tohoku region, and the new generation of youth born into the recession. Recessions affect populations unevenly, as we here in the US know all too well now. The same is true of Japan. The regions the hardest hit in the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crises were also those that had been most adversely affected by the halving of property values, stock market, and crisis of certainty. So too the recessionary generation. Those born in the late 1980s and on, who have never known the Japan that their parents did, and are now facing the reality of a frozen job market, more pressure to add on to their own individual value, and new requirements for entry into the world of full-time work. It's a new life course with which their parents are unfamiliar and cannot guide them through. But as I discuss elsewhere, as a result of a series of interviews with these young people, they also see their futures differently from their parents' generation, as national futures, like in the US, no longer guarantee personal ones in the same way. Thank you very much. So that's just about what I timed it as. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
I have a question about that graphic that came from The Economist.
Yes.
Because on the megaphone, that Japanese symbol is normally associated with what's called the ensign that's on Japanese naval vessels of World War II.
Yeah.
So was that done on purpose, and was there an implication there that patriotic education might create sort of the resurgent nationalism?
Well, that's exactly what they were saying. Yeah, and I'm sorry if what I was, my discussion of it is a sort of a lot longer in the particular paper about it. But this is certainly one of the effects of the crisis of certainly this patriotic education. And what I'm arguing is that if it's, you know, there is a certain kind of new nationalism that's been created in Japan. And the people who promoted this, these notes to the heart and things, you know, they had a part in this. But there's also a real sort of strong wave of what people call neoliberalism. You know, thank you. Which involves, which is a very different movement than nationalism. Clearly, what the Economist was suggesting was only one part of the picture. You know, that this is akin to the imperial rescript of education of the pre-war period, you know, and that's exactly what's repeating itself in Japan, and we should all beware because, you know, history just repeats itself in the same ways. And I'm suggesting that history doesn't repeat itself in the same, or that this future has a completely new set of conditions, you know. There is a very sort of complex set of things going on with this revision to the law and all of these other things going on. In that, as I tried to suggest, the government is trying to create a new kind of citizen subject who will receive less, fewer guarantees, fewer preparation and things like that, but dedicate themselves just as much. And how one does that is very unclear, right? But as you know, many people have suggested to me, like many things in economic times that just don't change, part of this is, you know, a short-term fix. You know, nobody really knows how to do this. Patriotism and love, you know, these calls to love of country, effective, as Ernst Renan said, Benedict Anderson has written, all people who think about, you know, what a nation is. When we use the word nation, we don't, just like modern, we don't talk about it a lot, but these sort of ties to an imagined community from, you know, New York to Georgia to whatever. These are predicated upon particular sort of implicit and sometimes also explicit agreements and guarantees between the nation and citizens. And as those break down, and again, we could talk about the United States here in other ways, but it was very forceful in Japan, you know. As these break down, you know, so does the sacrifice that people are willing to make, the hours that they're willing to work, the separation from their families that they're willing to undergo. This magic loyalty to companies is not so magic. You know, these are not miracles. Does that mean that I think that there is nothing different about Japan? No, of course I don't believe that. Right? Of course I believe that, right? But I think the conversations of Japan's difference then, in my first slide, and now, need, again, as Jeff was saying, to really be taken into consideration the history of these changes, right? And their complexity, the ongoing conversation and relationship to the way that Japan was viewed in the world as a non-Western nation, as inherently unequal no matter what they did. That's why Nakasone, when he spoke back to the US in 1980s, basically the other thing that he said was, we've caught up. Now we're going beyond, you know? I mean, these are, you know, sort of powerful messages that define the way that we see each other, and they trickle down into not only school textbooks and curriculums and things like that, but the ways that we, you know, misunderstand each other in the world, and then eventually, you know, have very concrete effects in, as I'm suggesting, the things that I was tracking actually produce laws and policies and things like that, you know, out of this incredible, and I am making the argument, and we'll see what my other academic colleagues, what all academic colleagues think of this trajectory that in my book that I'm finishing, I trace very carefully, you know, to how this, what I call this crisis of certainty, you know, was first created and then destroyed, and what that, you know, what the effects of that were. So yes, that was the long-winded answer. I absolutely believe that's what the Economist was after. I think they only got part of the story. I think the other part of the story, without that other part of the story, you completely miss the current realities in Japan right now that for sure the younger generation is going through, and for sure, you know, all Japanese parents know about but don't necessarily know what to do about. And here I just want to add a caveat. When I say all Japanese parents, I want to be really careful here, because urban Japan is not rural Japan, and Tokyo is not Osaka, and Kyoto and Kobe. All of these places have their very specific histories too. They have a national history and they have a regional history. And when I was called on to comment after the Tohoku, what they call the Daishinsai, the triple disasters and things now, and when people were talking to me, I realized that they imagined all Japanese to be standing in Tokyo, getting on those, cramming themselves into those trains. You know, the kind of questions that they asked me. I said, you know, let me tell you a little bit about the Tohoku region, you know, because this has a very, you know, they talk about self-discipline and all of these things, you know, like again, back to this old thing of Japanese culture and stuff. This place has, you know, these areas have a very specific experience with the need to be self-reliant. You know, historically, they've had to be more self-reliant. They were emptied out first in this push to modernization in the early 20th century in Japan. Then after, with double-digit growth, then a lot of their youth headed to the cities, you know, and they were hardest hit by the recession. Of course it's cultural, and of course it's culture. Does it represent everyone? Or if one more person asks me, if the Fukushima 5 are like kamikaze and they want to die, I don't know what I'll do. I refuse 5 interviews. I refuse to interview because at first it seemed, you know, sort of, tame. You know, they're like kamikaze and they like to sacrifice. And then I realized she meant to say, they don't care about dying. And I just thought, oh wow, this is really going too far. I said, you know, you should go back and look at the firemen from 9/11. Because this is not a matter of not wanting to live, you know? This is way more complex. So anyway, yes, go ahead.
I have 2 questions about the Kokoro no Moto.
Yes.
First of all, where did those come from? They were distributed, right? Where did they come from?
So they came out of
Yes.
the Ministry of Education.
Okay.
You know, who exactly wrote them? I know where the influences were. I mean, actually, it's a very good question. In this paper that I'm just publishing, I probably should know who the main author was. My guess is, from knowing the people in the educational bureaucracy, it was a range of authors. The influence, the most powerful influence here is, and this is, you know, kind of a long story. I'll make it very short now, maybe a little bit too short. But again, I refer to it in several of my pieces, is the main influence here is clinical psychology, and it's a Jungian psychology. This is, like most things in the world, and I guess why, you know, anthropology is a really interesting area to study, is that we study contingencies of histories. Strange bedfellows that come together, you know, different things that suddenly happen at the same time that shouldn't happen, and of all things, and during fieldwork, you happen to be in some of these places when things that are happening, and you know, sort of turn around and go, what? So I'll just tell you a little story of mine from my fieldwork. So in the year 2000, I was in the city of Kobe, which was, as many of you know, the site of a major earthquake in 1995 that destroyed much of the city. And even though, you know, a lot of that was rebuilt, the really poor areas weren't. And there's a long story about, you know, how that changed the city of Kobe, and, you know, sort of people lost a lot of confidence in their government at that time too. But there was something else that happened 2 years after that. In 1997, as I referred to, there was a sensational but also highly sensationalized event that happened in one of the areas of Kobe. It happened in one place by one kid, but you would have thought it was Columbine times 100. You know, there were kids all over. They don't shoot, there are no guns. Makes you think, right? But there are knives, of course. And a young man who had had trouble for a long time. He happened to be 14 years old, and there's a long history of him having trouble in writing very complicated diaries in elementary school and things that were missed or not missed. We all missed, and afterwards everybody said, where were the signs, the signs, the signs, and just like here, you know. But this became what he actually did that caught sort of this incredible national appeal was, and I write about in this article called The Wild Child of 1990s Japan, is he decapitated the head of a sixth grade friend and set it at the gate of his junior high school. But not only that, but with a note in the mouth that said that his existence had been stolen from him. It was a complicated note to begin with, but it talked about transparent existence, and he was, you know, wanted revenge against the school system. So that, which, you know, at the time it was called the Kobe event, and then it got all these other names. And he, because of the complicated laws in Japan, good laws at the time, actually, the juvenile justice laws, his face was, he was not allowed to be pictured in the paper because of retribution to his parents and things like that. So he was this anonymous shonen A or youth A. Okay, why am I telling you this whole story? It has something to do with the incredible influence that clinical psychology started to have in Japan and really hadn't had up until that point. So I happened to be, a couple of years afterwards, actually, there was a lot written, a lot talked about. By the time I got to Japan to do my field work, a couple of years afterwards, even though I made smaller trips in 95, 97, and things like that, this had spread into sort of national panic, and there were thousands of books, and at the time in 97, you know, the whole media descended on Kobe, ruined its property values even further, as you can imagine, and wrote tons of things about this. But nobody really had an answer, and the government wanted answers, and they wanted a way to explain, you know, what was going on with this kid. And as I was standing there with the education officials in Kobe, they made a call to a place in Kyoto where a very famous psychologist whose name was Kawai Hayao was located. Kawai Hayao was this very interesting man. He wrote about Japanese culture for a long time, but he was basically ignored. He represented a kind of psychology that a lot of Japanese weren't interested in. You know, it's all the Americans who do all this psychology. And they basically said to him, come up with a new language to explain this. And that's exactly what he did. And all of the kokoro no kyoiku, the emotional education, and these notes, but also, and as I write about in my book too, he was called in to head up these, you know, high-level governmental committees and write this key report on the structure of Japan in the 21st century. So this influence goes very, very far, but it really had to do with, you know, a government and a people who were really thrown, you know, a lot of curveballs. I don't throw curveballs and I don't throw anything, but I think that's an expression we still use. But they were really, you know, and so this is surely that influence, and crossed with the new neoliberalism that Kawai adopted, and that at the time Japan was beginning to, I mean, there was no way to continue to employ people to this degree, and there was no way to create the same, and it didn't make sense to create the same homogeneous workforce and population because you're not going to have this lifetime employment. Things by this time, the Japanese government knew it wasn't coming out of this easy, you know, and there's a long history to that too. So anyway.
My second question?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, I'm going to answer these shorter, much shorter.
Okay. The kokoro no noto, that whole idea of help yourself and help your nation.
Yeah.
How do you see this working with or working against the idea of the group in Japanese culture? If you're supposed to help yourself.
Okay, I promised I would answer that quickly, but no, I'm not going to be able to answer this quickly. You know, I can send you my latest piece, and it's about the recessionary, you know, this what I'm calling the recessionary generation, or this group of people. Now there's several of them, right? But this first recessionary generation, kids that were born in the late 80s, something like that, late 80s, and are now just emerging on the job market, have just finished school and things like that. And I guess one way to answer this, because this is a big question, right, is, I mean, it's got, there's, you know, sort of long histories to the idea of group versus individual, and lots of people ask, is there an individual in Japan? That's another whole set of questions that, you know, it's easier to answer in writing a little bit, because there's a lot to say about that, the genealogy of the idea, and what groupism is, and how it was promoted in Japan, you know, over this time. But I would say that this younger generation, right? Okay, I'm going to be bold here and take a thing, but is, as I said before, is very different than the parents' generation. The conditions of their life are incredibly different. I don't mean that I think they have just morphed into Americans. You know, like as soon as I say that, everybody says, "Oh, right, they finally Americanized." That's not what I'm saying. Right? Japan is not going to become American. The historical trajectory is different, you know? And even as there are lots of things in common in our modernization projects, you know, but the tensions and struggles and just legacy of being the first non-Western nation to do this, you know, to become #1 and then literally be written off by the world is not, you know, I mean, there's just a great deal that's different. So I'm not saying that. And I have to be very careful, because that's really the first thing that people say, oh, got it, just like the Americans, but worse. No, I'm not saying that, right? But this generation is really making its way in a completely new world, you know? And they have to build themselves. In fact, some of the words that these kids use is, I have to improve myself, you know? So does that mean there's no more groupism? No, I wouldn't say that. When I see my Japanese students, I teach a lot of them. They come as exchange students to the University of Washington. You know, there's still a lot of deference to what other people think, you know, but yes, the conditions of their life are changing, and that means that in complex ways, what we call culture, or the cultural, will change. How exactly, I would be very silly to say just a few words about that, but I hope that partly answers your question. I think there's somebody here and then over here. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah, of course.
Up until last December.
Here, maybe you could, thank you. I don't use this very well.
Up until last December, when I came up against the compulsory retirement age, I had a joint appointment at Seoul National University in Korea.
Yes.
In their College of Human Ecology.
Yes.
And the kind of discussions I got while I was there, the things I heard from my colleagues and their family,
Yeah, go ahead.
were things about the strength of Korea is its homogeneity. I saw the school system and the importance of the tests to enter universities, so much so that some of my colleagues, if their kids didn't make it on the first round into a good enough university, would hold them back. So a third of the students taking the exams for schools were doing it again, or they send them to the States. The loyalty that you talked about in the among the oligarchs, the Kaibol, the women who never see their husbands, the men who never see their kids play basketball because they're out every night drinking with the team, and so on. All of that sounded exactly like what you were talking about from that 1981 Time article that you put up there.
Yeah.
And it's working. Korea is quietly moving up the economic, I'm an economist, up the league table to, I think they are now 13th largest economy in the world. Yeah. So my question is, are they headed for a Japanese-style crash as an anthropologist?
If I can answer some of these questions, I'm going to get like a Nobel or something. Okay, these are great big questions, and I'm glad that you're asking them. I, you know, am. Oh, I really have to talk with this microphone. Okay, I will. Wow, that's hard. Oh, okay, because my father even couldn't understand. My father's in the audience. I'm so glad that he is. Yes. Yeah, because I wouldn't be an anthropologist of Japan today without his help, and there's a long story to that. Okay, so the Korea example is a fascinating example. I know less about it than I should, even though I've read just about everything I can, and I work with Korea anthropologists, but I have yet to make a fieldwork trip to Korea, and as a field working anthropologist or ethnographic anthropologist, I usually only speak with a great deal of confidence about things I've seen and observed and really sort of speak the language to know enough about myself. So I'll just make a couple of comments. I am going to Korea for the first time this summer. At the Jackson School, we've now come up with a new collaborative research group who are going to do research collectively in Japan and Korea. And there's a lot of interesting, my first project was on China and Japan, and that's the volume that's coming out, but now we're working with not only South Korea, but we're gonna try and make a trip to North Korea too. Anyway, yes, Korea is definitely moving up the ladder, and they know that. And the Korea Foundation is making sure that that's written about in lots of different ways. As a matter of fact, and for good reasons, Korea would like to be represented in the world the way that Japan was. Even though for many of us, where's Japan today? Let's write about China. But the Koreans are looking at the Japan model in that sense, and I know it because in talks that I give or talks that I sit in with Koreanists, they basically say to us, well, can we get some more of that? Lots of writing about Korea, and if they can, in a way that anthropologists like myself are sort of surprised about, they'd like to be what we call anthropologized, which produced lots of problems in Japan. Character studies, all this stuff, the Ruth Benedict thing, that's a very complex text, but there's a lot of things about that. Okay, now about, the other things I talked about the costs of all this wonderful modernization. Okay, it never comes without costs, right? Whether it's creative destruction, can we stop using that word on the one hand, or things on the other? A colleague of mine at Yonsei University has written a paper about the relentlessness of life in South Korea. Just an incredible sort of push kids who, leave their families at the age of 9 or 10 to come to this country just to get English to move ahead. If I said improving yourself and adding on, like even from Tokyo University, extra licenses and stuff, the Korean kids are like, and that doesn't mean that everybody's like that. And again, I want to say this, sort of with a note of caution because I'm reading about it rather than seeing it myself. But some of the things that I've written about are, we publish in the same journals as Korean sociologists and anthropologists. So yes, they will get richer and they will get more recognized, but and that's wonderful, and it's very important. I mean, we shouldn't take this too lightly, right? All of this child, adult, superimposed onto nations has real effects in the world, right? It's not just, how people think about you, but what they're willing to include you in, how much money they're willing to lend you. Wow, this, goes really far. What your credit rating is, what is the confidence about you in the world? This has so much to do with, right? So we can't, it would be silly to begrudge, right? Or to condemn them for doing something that the others did. And yet they're facing, similar problems, not this problem of being written off yet, because they're just trying to get written on as much as possible. But this, sort of really incredible, if my colleagues are right, and I believe they are, a real relentlessness of life that I see, my new project is about urban exit and about people sort of moving away from some of these things as, as the government moves away from these protections, creating new alternative spaces and livelihoods, sometimes reclaiming, sometimes rebuilding, sometimes living apart and, sort of building new forms of life. And that's what I'm going to Korea to see, that and other kinds of things. So thank you for your question. Yes?
I have a question about when I was teaching in Japan, I was in Nagoya, not in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And it was 10 years ago. I became really interested in where my students, I'm an English teacher, where they wanted to go and what they wanted to eat as kind of a economic indicator among other things. And so at the time, they were kind of done with McDonald's in Kentucky. Yeah. And they were kind of almost done, even though we had an Italian teacher in our staff and we had an Australian English teacher on our staff. they were kind of also done with Italian food, even though it was really good there at the time.
Yeah.
But then they were getting really interested in Pan-Asian. There were all these Asian fusion restaurants with Korean and Malaysian.
Question.
But when I ask my students that now here, I can't get a good answer because they already came to the U.S. So in Japan, what do a lot of the young people, where do they want to go if they could go, which they often can't now? Where do they dream of going, and what do they want to eat right now?
Well, food I know a little bit less about, even though it's a very good question. But I will be sure to ask my Japanese students when I'm in Japan, again, because it's just something to know. But I do know a little bit more about what some people call some kind of Pan-Asianism, or what a media scholar, a Japanese media scholar whose name is Iwabuchi Koichi, has called the return to Asia. And it's, he's writing about the arena of media and popular culture and things like that. I feel it with my students. You know, a lot of young Japanese are very interested in Korea in particular, but also in China. This is not my area of expertise, but I believe that there's a more complex relationship with China. For the Koreans, it's probably more complex with Japan than Japan is with Korea, and that's because a lot of Japanese youth don't really know that history. They don't study it, the imperial history. The Koreans know it really well. I did a series of interviews with a summer course of mine, students from a summer course, and I teach these split classes at the University of Washington. A couple of my courses are split classes, exchange students and UW students. The UW students love these courses, right? Japan studies majors who get to study with Japanese, or international studies students who get to study with Koreans and Japanese. So in the summer course this summer, we were studying about this new project of mine, which has to do with sustainability and things, and we formed a really good group. So I did something very interesting. I asked them to meet me for coffee afterwards and talk about their views of each other. And so I knew this was going to be troubling, but I also knew they'd been in the United States for a while, and they were roommates with each other, right? And I was really surprised by how candid they were. Again, we formed a really good group. They're all taking classes with me again, so it went well. And I think there were some conditions under which, people will talk to you. Anthropologists are always trying to figure out the secret for that, right? But around for coffee, drinking coffee over about 2 or 3 hours, they talked about, the Koreans on the one side, what they learned in school, and how they view the Japanese, and on the other hand, Japanese kids talked about Koreans. And some of it was not, easy to hear from this standpoint, but they heard it better than I did. They heard it better than I did. They sort of know on the one hand that the Japanese kids look down on the Koreans, or some of them. This was often gendered male, which was very interesting, whereas the females, my female students would talk about how they see the Koreans as sort of moving beyond them and improving themselves more quickly, for better or for worse. More English. In fact, I have a friend who was talking about how Korean universities, some of them have been talking about converting their curriculums entirely into English, even though their professors don't completely speak. This is a big move, right? So I would say, again, a long answer to a short question about food, but I would say that there is, really interesting movement in the area, certainly of pop culture and media, first from Japan to Korea and China, and now coming back with the Korean wave and things like that, and their group tours to Korea to meet things. So a lot of interchange there, even though publicly and diplomatically it gets really tough when there's territorial things that come up. Like Tsushima and these, things like that. But the youth have different conversations. They're learning these languages now, especially Japanese youth, newly learning Korean and Chinese. One, because they think that's where they might be working, So it's a completely, and I think the really sad part for me is they're gonna have to fill in that history. I mean, the Japanese kids come into my classroom, they don't know these, they don't know, they've never heard some of these imperial terms, and, again, on the Korean kid side, and this is something I'm gonna investigate when I go there, they just read the same old stuff about Japan. They know very little about contemporary Japan. And as some of my Korean students said, we don't have any other way to think about it, 'cause this is the only way. So, but they are on the internet all the time. And they get images and other things that are outside of the educational institution. This is a very, I guess we say that about every generation. It's fun for me to be working on, studying them and working with them, because this is, I hate to say this to most of you in the audience, this is not our era. It's theirs. They live in a totally different context than we do. The conditions of their life, just like my UW students, are different. They're very different, and as, parents and educators, I think, as much as possible, as a friend of mine who's also an anthropologist said, listen carefully to your students. The questions that they ask teach us about where they are. And that's, something that I learned from my Japanese and Korean students. I started paying more attention to my, to the questions of my UW students, not just to answer, but to think about why they're asking them in that way, right? Especially in the way they think about Japan and Korea, but also the ways they think about their own country. Okay. Hi. Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. He's going to bring you a microphone, too.
Thank you very much for your time. I just wanted to go back to the notes to heart.
Yes.
And I remember I was born in Tokyo and I grew up in the most rapid growth area. So I myself remember there's a class called Dotoku. It's an ethic class.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's actually a book. And then I was just curious, have you ever compare between that, ethic class textbook,
Right, the
with
Dotoku
the one
or
coconut,
Shishin,
and
that
how
kind of thing.
much was transferred to that in like a different wording. So I'm just pretty
Yeah.
much curious.
Yeah. No, it's a very good question, and I haven't. And that is an excellent project. It's a historical project, to be sure, right? It's a little bit of a cop-out, so I apologize. Because what you're suggesting is, if I was going to write at length about, these new, or if I was going to write at length about them, or if they were really, sort of the center of this new Dotoku Kyoiku, which they're not, then I would need to do that. But they're just these strange little books that appeared suddenly, all this money put into producing them, and they're just kind of one node in this sort of interesting, kind of larger campaign. And campaign is too concerted of a word for it. It's kind of a struggle, to reinterpolate, if you want to, the younger generation into some kind of new relationship with its nation, right? When they really are more responsible and the life course is changed. So I think Notes to the Heart is probably a small blip on the screen. Just these words were very interesting to me, and also the images. We could go back to that one of those floating, the kids little floating in the air. As I write about in my paper, you can't get further away from the environment of recession to that. I know that things are made cute in manga and things like that, but that is a great picture, because the reality that they're teaching their kids about looks nothing like that, So I think that's a wonderful project. It is a project waiting to happen. I don't know anybody who's doing it. I know some people who write about morals education in Meiji and Taisho and things, and then the ending of it at the end of the war, and then the reintroduction of it with a series of, they weren't exactly revisions, but something that's called Kitai Sareru Ningenzo. I don't know if you know what that is. It's called the image of the desired Japanese. It happened right around the 50s and the 60s when the LDP government was sort of pushing for high, whenever there's a push for high economic growth, the education system kind of does its work, right? Not any longer. There's a real big change with that now. And that's one of the things that I was making a point about. But it's a good question. And it's, especially for a Japanese person, it's a great project, right? Because you're going to go back and read a lot of morals textbooks, and it's a good choice, and it's an interesting choice. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, right here first and then over there. And just tell me when we're supposed to stop. I don't want to keep anybody from lunch.
Hi. Yours is the first of the symposium, and really the only in the symposium that specifically deals with a Japan-related topic, is
Yes.
sort of the limited the focus.
Yes.
From the event last night and from Jeffrey Wasserstrom's talk today, it seems like when we're looking at problems or when we're looking for visions of the future, the emphasis with China is trans-Pacific, it's international, it's looking for exchange. Of course, there's a tension between internationalist and nationalist forces and interests, but there seems to be that a consensus among the speakers, at least, is sort of this looking outward. Now, this new nationalism.
And can I
I'm
stop
sorry.
you for just a second before you finish? Who's looking outward? The Chinese are?
From both sides. From both sides.
Okay.
China
Yeah,
looking
got it.
trans-Pacific.
Got it.
Yeah. This new nationalist education, I'm really curious. I mean, nationalism, once again, in tension with, it can be in tension with internationalist interest. Is this a nationalism that is looking at Japan, but also Japan within the world and Japan with its interactions with this world? Or is it a nationalism that's more of a looking inward? You sort of suggested that the many issues of perceived double standard and Japan not being a normal country on the world stage.
Right.
Is this more of a nationalism that's looking inward, or does it also incorporate internationalism?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, great question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. One of the things that I didn't talk about today, but I easily could have, is the proposed, and now it's been put on hold because of the problems in the natural crisis that just happened, natural and man-made crisis in Tohoku and things like that. But just before that, the issue of not only revising this education law, but revising the post-war Constitution, particularly Article 9, which, as I think I said, this is not the first time that people have talked about this. In fact, the American government was very much in favor of doing it a long time ago. But just like with the education law, there was lots of opposition in Japan. There's a big argument now that the Japanese did write this fundamental law of education, but they only partially authored their new constitution, things like that. Whether they did or didn't, they embraced it, a lot of them, especially Article 9. Okay, so I think that's one of the things you're asking about, then I'm going to go back to education. Some of these things are not exactly the same, not all interconnected. So the people who are arguing for remilitarization, some of them, I think Don Hellman was talking about others. There's lots of different groups arguing for this. There are a number of people who are very against it. But some of those arguing for it are, there's two groups mainly. And again, I would say there are people who are, we might call sort of neoliberalists, right? And there are people who we might call neo-nationalists. And they coincide in interesting ways, and they diverge in interesting ways. That's a much longer discussion. And one of the articles that I referred you to on my reading list, The Roadmap to Millennial Japan, goes after that question. So, the nationalism that you're asking about, this nationalism of, sort of remilitarizing Japan and things, I would say is both internal, sort of looking back with a sort of longing gaze on the past when we had a military, and of course when you do have a military, at least it's a national military, right? There is this stronger sense of nation, and people serve and sacrifice, and I don't know, some people have seen the now cult film Battle Royale. All of your students and stuff have seen that, but that, within that, that's a very complex story, sort of school reform pushed to, sort of its parodic extremes and things like that. But within that, and the now deceased director of that movie said that he was also making it because he was a wartime kid, and he wanted to somehow recapture the camaraderie of battle. So there is a lot, they really, not a lot of Japanese, but some Japanese and is this gendered male in some cases? Perhaps, and there might be certain reasons for that. But if it, yeah, that's a dangerous statement. But some of this nationalism seems to be, and some of it really is that experience that I think we don't want to take too lightly or go past too quickly of national unity. I mean, remember just when we were celebrating, what was that, 9/11, just a couple of weeks ago, and there were all this talk in the United States of that moment when Americans seemed to come together, and there's sort of a joyousness to that, right? And as it breaks apart, it's very hard. Now take that imagination and use it thinking of Japan, because I always think that when we're always thinking of across and different, we just miss a whole lot of things, okay? This director who made Battle Royale was not talking about, at least trying not to reference, I believe, the imperialism in Asia and things like that. But he was talking about a moment when Japan seemed to have a concerted purpose, when people seemed to agree about things. I've talked out of another sense about what it meant to produce homogeneity, but there were costs and burdens of that, but there was also certain kinds of effective associations that came out of that. And it is breaking up now. So there's a kind of longing for it, no question. There's a nostalgia for it. People look at the youth, and that's been one of the main arguments, again, right back to here, that these kids need to be in the military. That's the argument in my neoliberal subject, right? Creating a new, and this lower class workforce is the ideal, of course, military, right? Just like here. So, that's that on the one hand. But I would say even that nationalism has an international side. I mean, Japan is looking with complex eyes at what's going on in China. There is a huge relationship there. They are each other's biggest trading partners, besides the United States, and Japan's probably now, right? But also long time, troubled histories intertwine, right? Prior to the Meiji period, a very different set of histories when, Japan looked to China as its mainstay of culture. Before that got its writing system, there's a long history to this. But, since the Second World War, very troubling. And most Japanese I know are not looking forward to China ruling the world. Not, as far as I can figure out. Young generation, again, quite different, because they might be working there, speaking Chinese, and things like that. So that's one. In the realm of education, this is very much different. This is not a simply nationalist education at all. It has very little in common. This I can speak of, because I've compared the fundamental law of education to the Kyoiku Chokugo, or the imperial rescript of education, which was the main education law during the Second World War period. They're incredibly different, even with the revisions. It's just nothing like that. This is not a return to that. If it's a new nationalism, it is a nationalism very much informed by the realities of recessionary life. It's a nationalism that looks out as much as it looks in. So that's just the beginning of my answer, but thank you for your question. Yes?
There in the early 70s for a U.S. financial institution, and was able to go around and talk to a lot of Japanese because I was soliciting business from them. Some of the folks that I ran into that had kids in their teens, late teens.
And this is in the 70s, right?
Yeah, early 70s.
Early 70s.
So these were the people that brought Japan out of
Absolutely.
World War II.
This is double-digit growth stat.
Absolutely. Observed that their kids didn't want to work as hard as they did.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that, along with many other factors, has led to what's happening to today.
Well,
I mean, they can't find jobs now.
I guess, yeah, right. So let's put the conditions and the new context in there, and then we can, then at least for me, it's a conversation that makes a little bit more sense. Yes, I didn't mean to go so fast with that. I should have said and leading directly from your question, that this is not the first time that parents in Japan have complained about the younger generation, just like in the US. But they've complained in large tones. Not only, and you can all correct me about the United States. Sometimes we think, we know less about the United States, even though I was born in Portland, and raised here, and, know less about this place. I'm standing in the grocery line, and I go, oh, wow, what are they talking about? I don't know anything about the place I live. But, you become a professional about other places in the world, and I do live part-time in Japan. But this is not the first time. But what I would say is in Japan, these comments have not only been personal, but national. Always individual development and national development very strongly wedded. And that goes right back to Jeff's comments about Chinese development, Japanese development, developing the nation, standing on the world stage. And as I always say to my students, take a look at that group of, what was it called, the group of 8? There's only one non-Western face there, and that is not to be forgotten, right? These moments were very important in the history of the world, right? And, all those comments about they're not working as hard, as sacrificing as hard as we did, they did it in the name of, a nation. And that was the complaint in the 70s, not as much in the 70s, because those kids really were working really hard, but they hadn't gone through the war. And what's really important here, and there was one more book I should have put on that list, which is called, it's a beautiful book, written by a Japanese cultural historian called Bodies of Memory. And it's exactly about, I always teach it, it's exactly about this period where, as the author says, he did this book because he was trying to recapture what his parents went through, So he writes about Yukio Mishima and a number of other writers who wrote at the time, but he's trying to capture cultural representations. And as he said, the occupation and high growth brought with it a forgetting of history and a repressing of memories about the war. And I think what some of these parents were saying was, these kids don't remember and don't know. They turned their back on that history forcibly, which also meant that they forgot what it had been. So when people came to Japan and said, apologize for this, that generation is like, for what? And now we're 3 generations down, But historically, to be fair, the American government had a big role in this forgetting and the repressing of memories and the shutting up of archives and things like that. There were very important, international reasons for this. I'm not an expert in this area. I have to read all that stuff too. But, So that generation, I would say in the 70s, and I teach this class called Changing Generations of Japan, so we read about this generational change. Yeah, it's a really fascinating class to teach. That generation was really, they lived through it, and they wanted to talk about the memories of the war and this kind of sacrifice, and their children were very far removed from that. The next generation of like the 80s and stuff were called moratorium ningen. Right, you probably remember that. The kids who just don't care about anything and they're on moratorium. And what I explained in my book is, while there have been, sort of generational change, discouraging sort of senses of what's happening with the new generation in Japan, nothing is like this. And the conditions have changed so dramatically. These were parents who were looking at a generation that was adapting to some sets of new conditions, getting richer mostly, for the most part, right? But with higher costs, remember fathers that don't come home as much, bigger, competition at school and things like that, each set of different conditions. But this one, I would say most people that I know in Japan compare this to sort of the third shift in modern Japanese history. The first one being Meiji, the second one post-war, and this one the recession, and that's why I'm writing about it. So in some way, I hope that answers your question. Yes?
But I think of this idea, I said forgive me, I may be conflating a couple of things you brought up. I'm thinking about the sacrifice that you referred to before, school to home to corporation.
Yeah.
I think all of that's kind of the idea that you're sacrificing individuality for the good of the family and for the community, the country. and now there's this new sense of sacrifice. But then you also mentioned Battle Royale and The Wild Child in Kobe in 1997. And I'm wondering, I think I've seen Battle Royale and I've used it in the class, and students love it because
Yeah, I really want to sit down in one of
short.
those classes and see what they love, because I was one of the first, I was the only non-Westerner sitting in, the only non-Japanese sitting in a theater full of people when it first came out, and the whole theater is quiet, right? And when the head pops off, I'm just like, I just screamed, you know, and everybody else is like, because they take it as, you know, as a real parody.
Right.
And I saw it as, oh my God, because I'm studying this. Is this where we're going?
Yeah, I gave it to the class in terms of how we deal with violence, and like, it's, oh my God, this is a satire. It's all satirical, and obviously about the Japanese school system that kills kids and all this stuff. And I'm wondering if this new sacrifice is fear of younger Japanese rising up, being angry at where they're at. So if this new idea of sacrifice,
Or the new call to sacrifice.
the new call to sacrifice is more of accepting limited expectations about what your life will be like.
I would say that's a good way to put it.
And I wonder if that's, you know, for fear of maybe youth rising up, although at the same time, the number of youth in Japan seems to be declining.
I mean, as many of my colleagues say to me, and I don't mean to put it this way, what will the United States look like with 20 years of recession? Japanese have done pretty well, you know. I mean, there's whatever you want to say about that, whether there should be revolutions or not, but, you know, not having their, you know, citizens kind of, you know, challenge whether we should pay for, I don't know, a whole set of things. So, yes, I think that that's part of it. That's absolutely part of it, you know, and then we could talk about what patriotism is and, you know, what it is and what it's for. My father's generation has one answer to it, right? They were good patriots, and he raised me to be a good citizen, right? Which I've raised my kids to be too, right? You know, and what that means. I mean, in his age, I'm just going to talk about him a little bit now because I like to anyway, but, you know, he had a small family business. He took care of his employees. He never fired one, no matter if they had profits or losses or whatever. You know, they took care of their people. That's what they did, you know, and and you know, you were a good, upstanding citizen. You cared about the other people, and that was the kind of patriotism that he taught me about. So that's one kind. There's others, right? And, you know, that's a set of questions. And I think to be fair, the Japanese government is struggling with this. I don't think these are, first of all, I don't think, sometimes Japanese history is taught like, you know, this group of Meiji officials who, you know, saw the future and had this concerted plan and knew what civilization and enlightenment would do or would be. That's way off. They tried and they failed, and they kept, you know, that first 30 years is all of these changes and policies and stuff. And as one Japanese historian who I really like writes about civilization and enlightenment, he calls it a Pandora's box. And it's a very interesting thing to think about. Once you open it, you do not know. It changed Japanese, you know, history completely from that time on. That's another good book to read, New Times in Modern Japan by Stephen Tanaka. Anyway, so I think that's, you know, absolutely part of it. But I think there's a larger conversation about what, you know, patriotism, what the nation, you know, at one time we were talking about the end of nations or something like that. I don't think we're there. But what the effective relationship to nations, you know, the nations will be, what we will be as citizen subjects of our nation in the future. I hope we're going to have that conversation in the United States, too. You know, just it'll happen in different ways than Japan. Thanks for asking the question. I think we have time for maybe one more. Okay, so there were two people who have had their hand up for a long time, so why don't we do it quickly? Yeah, I bet I'll answer more quickly. I'm not very good at quick answers. Yeah, go ahead.
When we think about Japan, you know, words like Toyota, Honda, Sony, Sanyo, these are things that come to...
And I didn't talk about those very much.
Immediately. And, you know, when we think about those in terms of perfection, excellence, and innovation... Quality and, you know, the 3.5 times productivity. Right. But in terms of Japan, those seem to have gone slightly in the background in the last few years, probably due to a lot of external factors. And you talked about educational reforms and nationalism. Currently in Japan, what is done at the post-secondary level? Are there a lot of professional, like engineering or other colleges? Or, I mean, we may be coming to that from the US background too, you know,
Excellent question.
in another 20 years or in a few decades. So.
Yeah. Well, one thing is I wish, and I bet a lot of Japanese who have been in this country wish that there were community colleges in Japan. And community colleges in the sense that when you are unemployed or, you know, the ability to be mobile, because these industrialized late capitalist economies, you know, shift and, you know, unemploy. And people need to be retrained or lives change, you know. And so far, at least, the Japanese economy is not there in terms of providing those resources for mobility. There are people who, and one of these words of terror, the new words of terror that I didn't get into here is uistua, which is shorthand for, you know, a Japanification of restructuring, you know, and a lot of people, especially mid-level people, have been restructured, and where they go from there. And you might all see the film Tokyo Sonata, which is the story of a Japanese like middle-level worker who, the first scene is a Chinese woman walking in, and she's about to replace him, and her headhunter or whoever that is who introduces her says, and she can work twice as hard for half the price. So, you know, that's one of the sad stories here, especially the half the price part. So, in any case, okay, back to the story. I think quality and those kind of things are still as important in Japan. I mean, I think I didn't mean to say that education is changing in that sense, that people aren't trained and there's not attention to detail and things like that. Post-graduation, my husband was trained as a civil engineer, and his, to be honest, a lot of this training came with the companies. You know, they got their BSs or BAs, and then the companies trained them on, you know, on the spot. The first year of their time in the company was really training, and that's where the really good training went. And then they were moved from department to department to actually be efficient and expert at all of these different areas. You know, he was in design, he was in all of these places. One of the questions is, will that continue to happen? I am not an expert about, you know, sort of industrial preparation and things like that, although I do have friends who are working on this. It's changing. I don't know exactly how. Quickly, post-secondary, or anyway, graduate education is the new area of innovation in Japan, I would say. There's going to be a lot more graduate schools. There's going to be a lot more graduate work. And some of it is to take up the slack, I think, from what companies no longer are doing. So very quickly, I could refer you to people who are working on it. Thank you. And we'll let you guys go for lunch. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And I'm a language teacher, Japanese language teacher, so I have to admit that I'm understudied in a cultural area, and I appreciate your talk.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned earlier about different levels of what your father has taught you as an individual and so forth. And so I may be a little bit naive in asking about this, but is there a difference between how you view how much emphasis the Japanese culture and society puts on, whether it's at the government level or whatever the cases might be, on the child versus the American culture?
I'm really glad you asked that question, except that everybody wants to go to lunch. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then one comment is that I remember I'm not going to reveal what year I was born in, but I do remember, my
You can.
mother.
It's probably about the same one I was born in.
No, I think you're much younger. But anyway.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. But I do remember when you mentioned the kokoro no noto, the note of the heart.
Yeah.
I recall my mother taking out. It is not a birth certificate, but it is a note that was given in those days, whatever the age it might be. But it said something noto, and I cannot remember if it was for young mother note. But anyway, it was the same premise, is what I wanted to share with you.
Yeah, thank you.
you.
So very quickly, the first part of the question I'll answer in just the second part of the question first. As Yuki, sorry, asked me earlier, the notes of the heart and where all of these terms were taken up. I studied, the psychological input and the way that crossed with neoliberalism and things like that. But, looking back over Shushin and Dotoku books would be a great project, and I think that's part of what she's asking about. The issue of the child, well, that's, sort of what where my research started, and then I just sort of followed these things out, as I sort of encountered this thing that I call, and many people are calling after me, I guess, the crisis of the child and what that means. But that's a longer conversation about how children came to, not children, but childhood came to serve as a trope of many things in the world, sometimes temporal relations, sometimes power relations, things like that. But I would say very quickly that, as I said about education, child rearing also in Japan has a completely different place than in the United States. And one of the first things I say to my students about this is, go look for the child rearing textbooks, books, manuals, and things like that in an American bookstore. Where are they? I mean, you can find them, and there's lots of them, but they're way in the back someplace. You know where they are in Japan? The front tables. They absolutely get this. The Meiji intellectuals wrote about it. You're creating new citizens. What kind of citizens do you want them to be? And, this got complicated in Japan because it got crossed with problems of difference and nationalism and all sorts of things, imperial soldiers and stuff. But, fundamentally, I still think that, just very quickly, one of the things that really motivated me to this study was raising 2 bilingual and binational children and all of the issues and problems. And if one more person says to me, isn't it wonderful to be bilingual? You just talk to my kids. Because they were raised with the competing nations too. But also my husband's, rise to the level of salaryman, which he then quit. But anyway, sort of that ability was all about the educational institution in Japan, that in the Meiji period, his family had no last name. They were peasant farmers. And it was only with the Meiji reforms that his family was, and the ending of the class system, that his father became a school principal, which we think of, oh, he's just a school principal, but that's different in Japan. The best paid and the smartest, guess where they are? They're in education. If they're not engineers, that's really where they are. It's completely, and from that standpoint, it's a much more complicated process. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that there's nothing wrong with Japanese education because I write all about that. But you have to be very careful in the United States when you say that and they go, oh, those terrible Japanese. So you go, keep this intention all the time. And, yes, I think it's a good question. And thank you for listening to me today. Let's all have some lunch. Thanks very much.